Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum 23 years ago. Each month, we share firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self-identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our conversation, please send us your questions and let us know where you are joining from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Peter Feigl share his firsthand account of the Holocaust with us today. Peter, thank you so much for agreeing to be our first person.
Thank you, Bill, for asking me, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to people about my experiences during the Second World War.
Peter, you have so much to share with us, and we have just an hour, so we'll jump right in. Peter, you were born in Berlin on March 1st, 1929. Please tell us about your parents and what you know of your family's life in Germany in the early 1930s before the Nazi Party came to power.
So, as you said, I was born in 1929 into a upper middle class family. My father, who was an Austrian citizen, was working in Germany at the time. He was a graduate mechanical engineer. My mother was essentially a housewife for raising me. My father and my mother were totally secular, wanted absolutely nothing to do with any kind of organized religion. And so I was raised without any religious background whatsoever. The family was well off sufficiently that with summer times, for instance, we would go on vacations either at the beach, or we would travel to Switzerland or Austria and visit family there. And things were going very nicely. 1933, when Hitler came to power, I, 4 years old, was fascinated by all of the military music that I heard on radio, the speeches, which I didn't understand really fully. But I was enthralled by all the flags and all the pageantry that the Nazis were producing. And this sort of went on until 1934.
Peter, if I could jump in and just ask you one question about prior to the Nazis coming to party. Tell us a little bit more about your father's business. He was a mechanical engineer. How did he support the family?
My father worked for a company that represented a number of American companies, among them Champion spark plugs and other companies in the automotive industry. And he represented those companies throughout Europe, so he frequently traveled extensively throughout Europe, promoting the products of those companies. And his company actually had offices in several other European countries.
Mm-hmm. And Peter, you began to tell us about what happened once the Nazis came to power in 1933 in Germany. You were just 4 years old. So yes, tell us how that affected your family at that time.
So I guess at the age of 4, you become conscious of what was going on around you.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
as I mentioned, I became fascinated by all this pageantry. I had led the toy soldiers that I played with, and I couldn't wait to grow up and be a soldier too. And the Nazis did a spectacular job of putting on all kinds of military marches, concerts on in the streets and on public parks and so forth. And I really loved all of this until I went to school finally in April of 1936, when I was 37. Right there I am carrying the traditional candy cone that every first grader becomes on his first day in school. And here in school, I learned how to read and write. And our teacher produced a book and read from it and showed it to us. And the book was entitled The Poisoned Mushroom. And on the cover, you can see this poisoned mushroom, which is very well known in Europe. He's got a big nose and a Jewish star on his chest. And the teacher was telling us that this mushroom represents Jews who are awful people. They lie, they cheat, they steal, they stink of garlic, they molest children. I didn't know what that meant, but obviously something bad. And they are to blame for everything that goes wrong in the world. And those are people that really should be treated like vermin. They should be exterminated. And not knowing any better, this is what my teacher was telling me, and this is something that was implanted in my brain. And I believe this. Little did I know at the time that Hitler and his anti-Jewish program was not aimed at a religion, but that they classified it as a racial category, and that I was myself considered as part of that race.
Peter, so the book that the teacher actually read to you in the classroom with that cover you just showed us, she read that aloud to the students.
Yes, and not only that, but we were asked to read some of the words ourselves after we had learned to form the strange characters that we were taught to write in at that time in Germany.
Wow. After that, Peter, your family left Berlin in 1936, I believe, moving to Prague, Czechoslovakia, and then a year later relocated to your father's hometown of Vienna, Austria. Tell us about your life in Vienna.
Life in Vienna was very good. My father, as I mentioned, was an Austrian citizen. He was born in Vienna, so he was back home. His two sisters lived in Austria at the time. And for me, there was a surprise waiting for me, because my mother and my father at that point had a conversation. And they concluded, look, we just left Germany. We heard Hitler ranting and raving against the Jews. We are in Austria, which is 95% Roman Catholic. And they have a long history of hating Jews. Why don't we have Peter baptized? So at that point, I was baptized, learned the catechism, had my first communion in Vienna. There you see me in my first communion outfit. From that point on, I really considered myself a Catholic. I even was on several occasions also asked to serve as altar boy. So life was good in Austria. I continued going to school there, and all of this sort of took a turn in another direction on the 10th of March of 1938.
Before we turn to that, just if I can ask you, Peter, and then I also want to share something with you. At that point, when you were baptized and later had your first communion, you considered yourself Catholic. Did you know anything otherwise? You just thought you were a Catholic boy?
I knew nothing other than that. I had no idea that I was part of the Jewish race. I just continued living. I went to church frequently. My parents allowed me to go there, or urged me to go there. And I had no way of thinking anything else.
Okay. Peter, before we continue, I'd like you to know that we have people watching and listening to you today from around the country. We have viewers in Illinois, Rhode Island, Nevada, Michigan, and Tennessee. And then we have people watching you today from Malta, Romania, Mexico, Germany, and Portugal. So a lot of people listening and learning from you today. I'd also like to share a comment that was submitted by a viewer, Christy. Christy writes, I met Peter a number of years ago when I was at the museum for a teacher's conference. I share his story with my students whenever I get the chance. So nice comment there.
Thank you for telling me that.
Peter, you began to tell us how things changed in 1938. Germany annexed or seized control of Austria in March 1938. And they received enthusiastic support from most of the country's population. What do you recall of that annexation by Germany?
Well, here I am, a 9-year-old at this point, And all of a sudden, they reappeared or appeared for the first time in Austria. All of the fanfare and the flags and the military marches and so forth that I had heard in my early childhood. And I found this fascinating. And I heard that Hitler was coming to Vienna, and I wanted to see Hitler. And I ran away from home and joined this mob. There were several hundreds of thousands of people waiting to see Hitler. We saw him coming by in a car, in an open car, and we were all screaming, "Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer," one people, one empire, one leader. And I was chafing at the bit to join the Hitler Youth because they had snazzy uniforms with a sand brown belt, and with the uniform came a dagger. And boy, did I want to join them and march with the drum corps that they had. That sounded just great. So nearly 4 hours passed before I got back home, and my mother was furious at the time. She yelled at me and she said, "Where have you been?" And I told her very proudly, "I saw our Führer." And my mother slapped me left and right and told me, "He is not ours, and don't you ever forget it." I was very confused at the time, but within a matter of about 7 or 10 days, we packed one suitcase each and left and headed for Belgium.
Peter, was it difficult for you to be able to leave and get out of Austria?
Fortunately, my father had no difficulty in doing so because, as I mentioned, he was traveling throughout Europe on business. So he had multiple entry visas for many countries, and his company had an office in Antwerp, Belgium. So at the border, we were interrogated by German police, and they asked my father, "Why are you fleeing the German Empire?" And my father said, "We're not fleeing the empire. As you can see, we only have one suitcase each. I'm going to my office in Antwerp, and I thought I'd take my son and my wife with me just for a week, and we'll be back in Vienna in no time at all." So they finally allowed us to go.
So Peter, that you took one suitcase each, so you literally left everything else behind.
We left everything behind, and I was, of course, very upset about the fact that I had to leave behind my electric train set and my toy soldiers and my stroller. And also, I found myself in a country where they didn't speak my language. They didn't speak German. So I had to go to school and learn not only one, but two new languages, French and Flemish. But what I didn't realize at the time was that for my parents, it was far more traumatic than for me, because, as you said, they left all of their possessions behind, furniture, jewelry, crystal, silverware, in other words, everything. And here we now lived in a much smaller, furnished apartment. And this obviously was far more difficult for my parents than for me.
Despite all of that tremendous change for them, did they feel safe once they were in Belgium?
They did indeed feel safe, because Belgium had been declared a neutral country about 6-7 years earlier. And there had been rumors of a possible war breaking out in Europe. And I overheard adults talking in terms of, well, if war should ever come, we have nothing to worry about in Belgium because we are in a neutral country.
Well, and as you're about to tell us, that all changed. World War II, of course, began September 1st, 1939, when Germany attacked Poland. When Nazi Germany attacked Belgium in May of 1940, the impact on your family was almost immediate. Tell us what happened to your father at that time.
Yes, on the 10th of May, when the Germans invaded Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, my father felt he had an obligation to go to his office and possibly pay out salaries to his employees, so that if they wanted to flee, they would be able to do so. On the way to Antwerp, at the railway station, there was an identity check. My father produced his German passport, and he was promptly arrested as an enemy alien, of course. And it took us 3 days to locate him. My mother and I went to see him. We were allowed to bring him a suitcase with a blanket and some clothing. And my father told my mother, get out of Belgium, get out of Brussels as quickly as possible. You don't want to get caught between two armies. You have the Germans coming from the east, and you have Belgian, French and German, excuse me, you have French and British soldiers coming from the southwest, coming to the aid of Belgium. So get out of here. So my mother and I and my grandmother, all three of us, fled with hundreds of thousands of refugees headed for France. It took us 10 days to get there. And on the road, we were frequently machine gunned by German Stuka dive bombers who were trying to block the roads to prevent the Brits and the French from coming to Belgium. And I, as an 11-year-old now, as we were lying in a ditch whenever we were being attacked, I thought of only one thing. When I grow up, I want to become a pilot and be in the cockpit of an airplane with a machine gun. That must be a lot of fun. And I didn't realize that the cow that suddenly dropped dead next to me had just been shot by that airplane.
And of course, Peter, as it would turn out, we won't have time to go in this today. Your later life, you became not only a pilot, but very, very much associated with the aeronautical industry. So that's for another time. That mass exodus, hundreds of thousands with Stuka bombers, besides the excitement that you described, that must be a very vivid memory of yours.
It's a very vivid memory. The most vivid one is the night that we came through Dunkirk, the place from which subsequently the Brits were able to take most of their troops back to England. But we drove through Dunkirk at a time when the entire harbor installations were in flames. The Germans had machine gunned the oil storage tanks and subsequently dropped one incendiary bomb which ignited everything. And so the sky was lit brightly with the flames as we were able to ride on a World War I truck through the city of Dunkirk. So I really remember that one.
Wow. And you made it to Paris. And then once you were there, your mother said you must go south. Why did she decide that you must go south? And where did you go?
Well, 4 hours after we arrived in Paris at my aunt's apartment, the air raid sirens went off. And my mother said, I didn't come here to be bombed. I could have stayed in Brussels for that. So we were able to get on one of the last trains that made it from Paris down to the city of Bordeaux on the Atlantic coast in the south of France. And there, my mother's rigid German upbringing, she had to go and report immediately to the police to get permission to remain in Bordeaux. And the French policeman scratched his head and said, I don't know what to do with you. You're a German woman who married an Austrian. That makes you Austrian, but there's no Austria. And you're here with your son and your mother, and you don't have a visa. You don't belong here. Go to the gendarmes. There was the national police, same thing there. They sent us to the prefecture, which is the civilian administration. And there they told my mother, we have experts who know just how to deal with people such as you. You're going to take a train and go to a place called Oloron-Sainte-Marie near the Spanish border, and they know what to do with you. So with the little money that my mother had left, we took a train with my grandmother, and in Oloron, the train was surrounded by French gendarmes with machine guns, and they loaded us onto trucks, and 20 minutes, they dumped us into a French detention camp called Gurs.
Tell us about Gurs. What kind of place was this?
Gurs was a detention camp that had been created by the French about 3 years earlier, and it was intended to hold refugees from the Spanish Civil War. The camp had a capacity of about 14,000 people. Each barrack held 60 people. There were no beds in the barracks. You slept on the floor. The barracks had no hygienic facilities. There was no toilet in there. There were no water or anything. The only water was one cold water spigot on the outside of the barrack. and the toilet facilities were located about 200 yards away. They were open pits. The whole place, it was disgusting and it stank. It was mid-May, temperatures were high. And we were all obsessed with one thing: food, eating. There was no food. We, for breakfast, would have a lukewarm fluid called coffee with one slice of bread. Lunchtime was more, another slice of bread, this time with a lukewarm fluid. You might find 2 or 3 slices of carrot floating in it, so you were lucky. And dinner was a repeat of lunch. And on top of that, even though there were no beds, we had bed bugs there. We had body lice and fleas. People were dying from disease and starvation. And it was a horrible place that I will never forget.
And that image that we just had up, of course, of rows and rows and rows of barracks was from Gurs. After 6 weeks, you were there for 6 weeks. You were released, however. How was that made possible?
That became possible because the French surrendered and signed an armistice with the Germans on the 22nd of June, and my mother, who was a barracks chief, the barracks chief received periodic briefings from the camp commander, and she learned that there would be a German army inspection team coming to Gurs to see whether there were any Germans held there who would be able to repatriate it back to Germany. So my mother placed herself at the entrance of the camp on the day when the team arrived. She figured it being an army team, they weren't looking for Jews, or they were just looking for German citizens. And when she saw the team, she rushed forward, brandishing her German passport and sticking it under the nose of the team leader, yelled Heil Hitler as loud as she could, and said, "I am a citizen of the great German Reich. I have been held here by these no good, lousy, stinking French people, together with my mother and my son. I demand to be released immediately." And the German officer looked at the passport and turned to the French camp commander and said, "You call taxi for madame. Taxi takes madame where she wants to go." And 20 minutes later, we were in a taxi. And the cab driver said, "Where to?" And mother said, "Take us to Spain." He said, "Impossible. They won't let anybody in, and the French won't let anybody out." "Where to?" "Take us north." So we started driving north for about 4.5 hours.
With no certain destination, just going north.
No destination. When we came through the town of Toulouse, one of the major cities in France, my grandmother left us because she had discovered, I don't know how, but she found out that when my aunt, who had been in Paris, managed to get to Toulouse, and my grandmother said, "Look, you have enough problems handling Peter. I'm going to leave and join my other daughter, and good luck." So we continued driving for about another hour until we came to a town called Auch. And there the cab driver was stopped and told, don't go any further. There are Germans on the other side. And that's when my mother rang the doorbell of a big, large red brick building. It turned out to be a convent.
So she just picked out that building and decided to go there and
was the nearest building.
test her luck.
From the railroad tracks where we had stopped. And so the nun listened to my mother's story. And by the way, this was the first person who did the right thing, who really helped us. She put my mother in touch with a local food distribution center, which had been established a couple of years earlier to help Spanish refugees. And this center was operated jointly by the Swiss Red Cross and American Quakers. And they offered my mother a part-time job. With a part-time job offer, she was able to go to the police and get a residence permit, allowing us to remain in Auch. And of course, she also had the opportunity of bringing home almost daily food from the canteen. You see my mother here in the group of people operating that food distribution center. So we now lived in a very, very tiny one-room apartment, and I mean really one room. That room was bathroom, bedroom, dining room, living room. That's all that there was, but at least we were there. My mother then tried to find out what happened to my father, and ultimately discovered in late September that he also ultimately wound up in Gurs. And my father was 16 years older than my mother. So in those detention camps, he developed heart problems. And in March of 1941, he was given a 30-day convalescence leave. The camp commander must have figured, let him die outside, let his own family take care of his burial. So he was able to join us in that one-room apartment, but at least we were together, and my mother succeeded on a monthly basis to get an extension to this convalescence leave that my father had. And then she tried everything possible to keep him
So
alive.
when you were reunited at that period after he was released from Gurs on convalescence leave, had your mom, until she found him, had she had any communication with him since you last saw him in Belgium?
No, the first communication she had with him was in September when she located him. First, some postcards, and as a matter of fact, in October she was given permission to visit him, and she spent, I think, a day visiting him in Gurs.
Peter, I'd like to, before we continue, I'd like to just remind our audience to please share any questions that you have for Peter via the chat feature, if you would do that. And I'd also like to let you know that one of our viewers has just written, how extraordinary the love of your family and the bravery of your mother and grandmother. Thank you for sharing. That's one of the comments from one of our viewers.
I thank our viewer for responding.
So Peter, you're after you were reunited with your father, your mother and you and your father remained together until the summer of 1942, when you went to a summer camp that was run by the Quakers. What happened to your parents while you were away at camp?
Well, first of all, my parents, my father was not allowed to do any work. The Vichy government, which was the government run in the southern part, the so-called unoccupied zone of France, passed anti-Jewish laws that were even more restrictive than the Germans' Nuremberg laws. And so he wasn't able to gain any money at all. My mother was working as a cleaning lady and so forth in order to try to keep us alive. And it was difficult. Fortunately, the Quaker canteen arranged for me to go to a summer camp, which was located about 20-25 miles away from from Osh that summer. And I was very happy to go there. There were other children, and the camp was run by a lady who was a devout Catholic, and took me almost daily to 7 o'clock mass with her. And in the middle of August, somewhere around the 5th or 16th of August, my father suddenly appeared. He had ridden on his bicycle, which was very surprising to me, considering that he had his heart trouble. And he came to give me a small pouch, which he put in my pocket and told me to keep it. And he said he had to go back right away to Osh because there was a curfew and Jews were not allowed to be on the street after dark. So as he climbed on his bicycle, we were on the crest of a hill, he disappeared from my view, and as he did so, I was overcome with a horrible feeling that this is the last time, I'll never see him again. And indeed, a few days later, on the 27th of August, Mrs. Cavaillon called me to her office and said, "I'm sorry, Peter, to have to tell you that your parents were arrested yesterday. I don't know, I have no further information, but don't worry about it. I'm going to organize a novena, And at the end of the nine days of prayers, I'm sure your parents will be restored to you. And that prompted me to begin writing a diary in which I was going to record on a daily basis what was happening to me, around me, and so forth. Because as you can see here, this is the front cover of the diary. I crossed out the word carnet, which means a small notebook, and I wrote there, diary dedicated to his parents, and then my name, Feigl Pierre, and August 27, 1942. And on the right side, I wrote, this diary is dedicated to his parents in the hope that it will reach them both in good health. Signed, their son, Pierre Feigl, Chambon, on the 27th of August, 1942.
And that began, of course, you're keeping that diary, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And just note that that was written, 81 years ago in your hand. Peter, soon after the arrest of your parents and you finding out about that, French gendarmes, police, came to the summer camp where you were looking for you. Why'd they come looking for you, and how did you evade them?
Well, the gendarmes came to arrest me because I was registered in the Vichy government as being a member of the Jewish race, and they were rounding up the Jews at that time. And fortunately, Mrs. Cavaillon, the director of the camp, made me sick and told the gendarmes that I was too sick to be moved. I was running a high fever. They confirmed after taking my temperature that indeed I was untransportable. And this is recorded in my diary. And they came back on a couple of other occasions. Meantime, Mrs. Cavaillon wrote to the Quakers in Toulouse and said, you've got to help me. I have this Jewish child on my hand, and the police are here to arrest him. The Quakers told her that they have been given permission to take 500 orphans to the United States in the latter part of November. Have Peter fill out these forms, which I did. And under religion, I wrote Catholic. And a few days later, the Quakers wrote back and said, Mrs. Cavaillon, you don't understand. We're trying to save Jewish children. And Mrs. Cavaillon wrote back to them and said, no, you don't understand. And by the way, there are copies of this correspondence in the archives that have been found. She wrote back, you don't understand. When I show Peter's baptismal certificate to the French police, they say it's garbage. As far as Vichy is concerned, that child is of the Jewish race. So the Quakers relented and decided to include me in this group of 500 orphans. And in fact, Mrs. Cavaillon then took me personally to Marseille, the port from which the ship was supposed to leave. She took me on the 6th of November.
Before we turn to that, I'd like to note that you continued keeping a diary for over 6 months at that time. Tell us what you really focused on in that diary, and if you wouldn't mind reading a couple of excerpts from your diary from that time to us.
Well, I recorded almost daily what was happening because it was my intention to show my parents, when I'm reunited with them, that I behaved as they would have expected me, that I was a good boy. And so I recorded many things. I also showed in the diary, obviously, that I was missing them terribly. And I can quote to you, for instance, on October the 21st, 1942, as an example, I wrote, nothing. How I would love to hear from you. If only the war would end soon. Not one aid organization knows where you are. So you can see I was crying out for them, hoping to be reunited someday. On December the 25th, 1942, which is Christmas Day, of course, I wrote the following. I wrote, Noel, Noel, Noel. This is a day that is normally so joyous, but you are far from me. Where? If we could only celebrate our Christmas quietly around a very modest Christmas tree in Auch. Oh, well, perhaps next year we will be together again. We ate well at noon and also in the evening.
Thank you for reading. Thank you,
Yes.
Peter, for reading those. Thank you very much. We have a question from one of our viewers named Ashna, and Ashna asks, "What kept you going despite everything? What helped you push through those darkest days?"
Well, 1942, I'm a 13-year-old boy. I'm not particularly introspective. You live from day to day. And as I mentioned earlier, the food was severely rationed. And one of the main concerns that all of us had was, will there be anything to eat tonight? And but essentially, I just went from day to day and never questioned how come this food is here, who provided it. You just accepted it, you ate it, and hope that tomorrow will be the same. So
Thank you, Peter. With assistance from the Quakers, as you said, and in fact, you were accompanied to Marseille on November 6, 1942, believing that you were going to be leaving for the U.S. as part of this group. But on November 10th, just a few days later, Allied forces landed in North Africa, and as a result, Nazi forces occupied all of France. This ended your chance for immigration, your chance to leave. How did you, with that tremendous change in circumstances and expectations, how did you find shelter?
well, again, thanks to the Quakers, they realized that the problem. They realized that the ship wasn't going to sail on the 26th or the 27th of November. And I was moved from one facility to another. Again, it's all described in my diary. I did some stupid things in the process as well. But finally, in January of 1943, I was given instructions to take a train, change trains in Lyon and so forth. And ultimately, I arrived on the 15th of January at midnight at a plateau high about 3,400 foot elevation. The roads, everything was covered with snow and ice. And I was met there by a young man who sort of put his arm around me and said that his name was Daniel Trocme, and he was going to look after me.
So you ended up in this village as a result of that. This was a very significant village. Tell us about it.
It was the most significant and the most unusual village. France, as I mentioned, was also essentially 95% Catholic. And here is a village where the population is about 95% Protestants. They are the descendants of the early Protestants, also known as Huguenots in France, who were persecuted back in the 16th century. And there was an infamous massacre, the Saint Bartholomew massacre in Paris, where some 10,000 Protestants were slaughtered by the Catholics at that time. Well, their descendants here established able to settle down and survive. These are people who are strong believers in the Bible, and some 5,000 residents in Le Chambon and in the surrounding area decided, inspired by their pastor André Trocme, who told them, now is the time to fight the enemy with the weapons of the Spirit. They knew what he meant. And there was a documentary made about the village. And I'm very moved about it. There's an elderly lady who shuffles towards the temple, and she's carrying a Bible in the crook of her arm. And the film producer asked her, but Madame, how could you do this? It was very, very dangerous. It was against the law to help Jews. You could have been executed for doing so. And she, in the most natural way, taps the book and says, it says so here, that if someone is hungry, you share what food you have. If someone needs shelter, you open your door and you provide shelter. And these are remarkable people who could have enriched themselves by selling what little food they had on the black market, but instead they fed and sheltered some 3,500 refugees, of whom they sheltered some 5,000 refugees, of whom about 3,500 were mostly Jewish refugees, and I was one among them. You see me here in that photograph in the group of about 24 children that were sheltered in the home that was managed by Daniel Trocmé, the cousin of the pastor, André.
And speaking of Daniel Trocmé, if you don't mind, Peter, tell us about him.
Well, Daniel Trocmé was also in charge. He was about 26 years of age. He was also in charge of another home that had older boys, all boys, and he was a young man who who contacted André Trocmé and told him that he needed to do something worthwhile of his life. And André told him, I can use you here, come here. So he was in charge of our home as well as the other one. And in June, he learned that the Gestapo was raiding the other home, the Maison des Roches. He rushed there to try to protect the boys in that home. He was promptly arrested by the Germans at that time and deported with the boys. As we learned many years later, he was ultimately killed in Majdanek, another German extermination camp in Poland. And his crime was that he was helping Jews, and the Germans simply couldn't believe that a non-Jew would go to the trouble of helping. So that was his crime. And
Peter, I was struck by the fact that this photograph of Daniel Trocmé was a gift that you made to the museum. Tell us about the photograph.
Well, the museum provided me and many other people with false identity papers. So instead of being Peter Feigl, born in Berlin, I became Pierre Feusson, a nice French name, born in Auch. And I, together with 4 other boys, for instance, we were sent after Daniel's arrest. We were sent later to a French boarding school, and so that we would be able to continue with our education. And in order to provide these identity papers, they had to take passport photographs of everyone. And for some reason that to this day I don't know why, they were extra pictures, and we each wound up with 3, 4, 5 of these pictures of everybody else. And I foolishly, against instructions, wrote on the back of those photographs the real name and the false name of the people. And when I was sent to the high school in Figeac, against instructions, I took them with me because that was my family, if you will. That was the only family that I had at the time. And I carried those pictures all the time, even later, as I fled into Switzerland, and was able to bring them with me and donate them to the museum.
That was remarkable that you hung on to those and that you had them in the first place. Peter, you marked the end of 1942 and the start of 1943 with photographs of your parents in your diary. But soon after that, your diary suddenly ends on February 1st, 1943. Tell us why you stopped writing in that diary.
Well, the diary ended on the 1st of February 1943 when Daniel Trocmé saw me writing, and he wanted to know, what are you writing? He looked at it and he realized that it was a diary which contained a number of dates, names, addresses of people, and had the diary fallen into the hands of the police, it would have been curtain for those people. So he confiscated the diary, and it disappeared for the next 50 or so years.
I hope we get a chance to talk a little bit about that. Peter, the left-hand side of your diary, as we see here, is written in French, and the right page is written in German. Why was that?
Well, that was done specifically in order to prevent my other children with whom I was, especially the boys who were nosy, from digging through my writings and being able to read what I was writing there. So I decided to continue writing in a secret language, which they and the police wouldn't be able to understand. I continued and wrote it in German.
As you mentioned, you were given this false identity of Peter Feigl, born in Auch, but you had the same birth date. No change in your birth date. Why was that?
Well, we were instructed that if we are stopped for an identity check, the police will look at the papers and they will ask first, what's your birthday? And most of us instinctively, after 10, 12, 15 years, whatever your age, you will blurt out your real birth date. And they didn't want us to be there. No, that would have been a dead giveaway. So they kept the same birthday, and they told us that all we had to do is remember the new name and just repeat it. That is your new name, Pierre Feigl, and your place of birth is Auch, France.
That's what you had to remember. Yep.
That was drummed into us.
You stayed in Les Chambon for 10 months, and in the fall of 1943, you were sent to a boarding school in the town of Figeac. Tell us about your time in Figeac.
Again, in Figeac, we were able to continue our education. I was concerned about the fact that of the other 4 boys that came with me from Le Chambon, there were 2 of them who spoke with a heavy Polish or Jewish accent. So I kept myself apart from them as much as possible in order not to be identified with them. And many years later, I learned that there had to have been someone at the school who knew very well that we were not native Frenchmen. And it turned out that it was the principal of that school, who was also, by the way, recognized by Yad Vashem as just among nations, but at great personal risk to himself and his family. He protected us and never gave us away.
Were there other Jewish children there besides you?
To my knowledge, only I and the other 4 boys who came from Le Chambon.
Okay.
Yes, we were the
You
5
were
of
it.
us.
You started writing back in your diary again in January 1944. What motivated you to start up again?
Essentially, the same thing that motivated me originally. I was still hoping someday, somehow, to reconnect with my parents. And since Daniel Trocmé wasn't there to keep me from writing, I began a second diary on the 1st of January. And again, kept a record on a daily basis of what was happening to me, what my grades were in school, what books I read, what I did in my free time, who my friends were, and so forth. And I kept this up. And for instance, on the 12th of May of 1944, I recorded that the town had been invaded by a SS division, Germans, who rolled into town and ordered all the males between the ages of 16 and 54 to report for assignment to a labor detachment. Well, at this point, I was a little smarter than I was when I was in Marseille. And even though I hadn't turned 16 yet, I decided I better lie low. I was still going to church at the time. I was an altar boy in the adjacent church. So I knew my way in there, and I hid in the bell tower for 24 hours. From the bell tower up there, I was able to see in the distance where the males were assembled and loaded onto trucks and taken out of town. And after about 24 hours, when the last truck left, I came down, and I was contacted by a French underground, essentially Jewish fighters who had masqueraded as Boy Scouts. And they told me that it was much too dangerous for me to remain in town, and to be ready to move on a moment's notice, and they will give me instructions where to go.
And of course, eventually, not long after, in May 1944, you were able to escape to Switzerland and remain there until 1946. How did you make it? How did you get to Switzerland, and how did you know you were safe?
Well, on the 22nd of May, I got instructions to take a train again, told where to get off. I actually was part of a group of some 24 kids who didn't know one another. We were spread all over the train. And there was sort of a mother hen that was keeping an eye on us. She had been doing this for quite some time already. And in fact, the German Gestapo was just looking for her. Anyhow, we were instructed to get off the train in Viry, a small town, a small village, and there two passeurs, those were people smugglers, would take care of us. They gave us instructions on when to cross, where to cross, how to cross the border into Switzerland, and on a sign when there was a change of the guards, we were to go over the first row of barbed wire fence, and we would then find ourselves in the so-called no man's land. You had to run through the no man's land and get over to the next barbed wire fence, which is the Swiss barbed wire fence. We got over that one, and once we were on the other side, there was a Swiss soldier who ordered us, who arrested us, and ordered us to get behind that building that you see there. Of course, we were illegal immigrants, and later on that day, that evening, I drew that sketch of the border crossing. It was burned into my mind, and you can see on the bottom it says France. That's the French side, and there's the first row of barbed wire. You can see the word no man's land and Swiss written in it. That is the Swiss side. And then over the second barbed wire fence, and then Soral Roman 2, that was the border crossing station on the Swiss side. Once we were on the Swiss side, we were loaded onto trucks, and the Swiss took us to a triage center, a small camp outside of Geneva, where they were going to decide what to do with us. And on the way to interrogation, someone, an older person, warned me and said, be very careful what you tell the Swiss authorities. They're sending the Jews right back into the waiting arms of the French and the Germans. So during interrogation, I pulled out my baptismal certificate. And when I showed it to the Swiss interrogator, he looked at it and he said, mais tu es catholique, bienvenue en Suisse, you're a Catholic. Welcome to Switzerland. So for me, fortunately, that was the end of the war. My father had given me the name of a business associate of his, a Swiss business associate. I gave that name to the Swiss authorities. They contacted that family, and that family decided to take me in. So I was given a refugee identity booklet and was allowed to join that family in Bern, Switzerland. And one of the first things they did is they bought me a new suit, because the clothing that I had were terribly torn and so forth. So here you see me in a very fancy brand new suit and brand new shoes.
Yeah. Peter, do you recall what you were feeling when you closed your diary on May 22nd, 1944 with, quote, "Then I sleep soundly in a free country," end quote?
I was old enough at that time to realize that once in Switzerland, Swiss country that had been out of the war, I was now safe. I wasn't going to be arrested or persecuted. And it's another way of saying I now sleep in freedom. I'm in a free country.
Peter, we have a question submitted from Instagram. And the question is, when and how did you find out what happened to your parents?
Good question. Of course, shortly after they were arrested, there were two postcards that Mrs. Cavaillon, the director of the home, the summer camp, received from them, begging them to look after me. The last card was from a place called Drancy, which is a suburb of Paris. and supposedly they were being sent eastward for quote resettlement. No one really knew what that meant at that time. Many years later, of course, I found out that Drancy was the place from which all the Jews that had been rounded up in France were sent to Auschwitz. And I did not find out about Auschwitz until January of 1945, when the Soviet troops who were moving from the east and winning over the Germans, they came across the Auschwitz camp, and Switzerland, where the Swiss press had reports, photographs, and so forth of what was reported from Poland, and when I read those articles or heard about it, I realized that this might have been the fate of my parents. It wasn't until years later that I had any documentary proof that indeed that was their fate. They had been arrested, as I said, on the 26th of August. They arrived in Drancy on the 2nd of September, and they were loaded onto convoy number 28, convoy 28, on the 4th of September, and arrived in Auschwitz on the 6th of September.
Peter, you mentioned earlier, of course, that your diary, your first diary, was confiscated from you for good reason, but it was gone. And so we have a viewer named Aileen who asks, how did you get reconnected with your diary?
Good question. As I mentioned, there was a documentary made of the village of Le Chambon, a documentary entitled Weapons of the Spirit. And I have a brief scene in it where I'm interviewed. When that movie was shown in French movie theaters in 1989, I received a letter from a man in Paris asking me whether I was the Peter Feigl who had dedicated the diary to his parents. I suspected it might have been a scam, but at the time I was crossing the Atlantic every 4 or 5 weeks. So I stopped in Paris, and sure enough, he had my diary. Where did you get this? He said, well, I'm a collector of such artifacts and memorabilia, and I bought it on the flea market in the south of France about 3 or 4 years after the end of the war. And by the way, I read it, and I suspected that you probably had been sent to Auschwitz and killed, and I published your diary in France. Well, I wanted my diary back. So he told me he was a poor man and he had to pay to have it published and so forth. Anyhow, after some negotiation, he agreed to sell it back to me for $265.
But
so
he made you pay for it. He made you pay for your diary.
I paid for it cash, and that's how I got it back.
Wow, that's truly remarkable. Peter, we're close to the end, so I have just one more question for you. As we face rising anti-Semitism, related conspiracy theories, and Holocaust denial, please tell us what we can learn from what you experienced during the Holocaust.
I think the most important thing here is something that I tell students when I speak in schools. People are taught consciously or subconsciously to hate other people. And in my case, as I told you, I was taught to hate Jews, even though I was considered as being one of them. When I speak in schools, I tell them there isn't anyone in this classroom who has not either been bullied, was the bully, or witnessed being bullied. And the next time that you witness such a thing, it behooves you to stop it right then and there, dead in its tracks. Why should you do that? I'll give you 2 good reasons. The first reason is because it is the right thing to do, and everybody knows right from wrong. The second reason is that it's self-preservation. You might someday be in a minority. Why is that important? Well, the Germans, the Nazis, in order to gain and retain power, needed someone to blame for everything that they could not achieve, for everything that went wrong. So they decided the best minority for them was the Jews. They were less than 1% of the total population, and they were the fault of everything else. And it is not inconceivable that you listeners and you in that classroom might not someday find yourself in a situation where the economy is going bad in the country, high unemployment. Somebody comes along and promises to solve all your problems, and the only problem is the people who are really to blame for all the problems we're having is you in the back row with freckles and red hair, or you with the dark skin, or you who speak with a foreign accent. So you might find yourself in that minority. So as the German minister,
Get Goebbels.
yeah, as he said famously, he was first supporting Hitler, then he decided it was wrong. He was arrested.
Pastor Niemöller.
Niemöller.
Pastor Niemöller, yeah.
Pastor Niemöller put it this way: when they came to arrest the Jews, when they came to arrest the socialists, I said nothing, I'm not a socialist. When they arrested the unionists, I said nothing, I'm not one. When they arrested the Jews, I'm not a Jew, I said nothing. When they came to arrest me, there was no one left, but there was no one left to speak up on my behalf. And that is the lesson. The next time you see it happening, stop it dead in its track, or else you might find yourself someday in the minority that's being pursued.
Peter, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We could have gone on, I think, all afternoon. I wish we could share all that happened once you made it to safety and left Switzerland. But thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you very much, Bill, for interviewing me. And thank you very much to the audience for listening to me. Thank you very much. Bless you all. Thank you.
I would like to take a moment to thank our donor. First Person is made possible through generous support from the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. I'd also like to invite you to join our next First Person program. Please tune in with us on June 21st, 2023 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for a conversation with Holocaust survivor and museum volunteer Henry Weil. Henry and his family were forced out of their apartment in Vienna, Austria, after Nazi Germany annexed the country. Learn how the Weil family managed to escape Vienna as it became more dangerous for Jews and make it to America. Thank you for watching today.